My driveway has always been a little unconventional, but nothing turned heads quite like the sight of my personal aircraft sitting proudly between my garage and mailbox. The illusion of suburban calm was shattered the very next morning when the HOA president himself stood outside my gate, waving a violation notice like he was issuing a royal decree. His expression was a perfect blend of righteous indignation and simmering disbelief, as if the very presence of my plane had personally insulted him. I opened the door still holding my coffee, barely awake, only to have him launch into a tirade about how my aviation stunt was a breach of every imaginable community code. Apparently, parking a fully functional aircraft in one's own driveway was considered unsightly, hazardous, and a threat to neighborhood harmony, though I couldn't recall any specific rule forbidding it. He rattled off a laundry list of violations from obstructed sightlines to improper vehicle classification, pausing only to jab his finger toward my plane like it was a ticking time bomb. The man was so apoplectic I thought he might actually combust right there on my lawn, his voice quaking with the absolute certainty that I had committed the gravest sin in the HOA's holy book of rules. His closing statement, though, was what caught my attention: a formal threat of fines, escalating penalties, and potential legal action if I didn't remove my plane within 48 hours. That's when I couldn't hold back a grin, because this poor man had no idea who he was talking to. I invited him into my home, just to watch his expression curdle when he saw the wall of framed documents proving that not only did I legally own the plane, I also owned something far more important: the entire neighborhood itself. Every street, every sidewalk, every manicured lawn existed under my sprawling network of holding companies, making me not just a resident but the effective landlord of the HOA itself. He went pale as I casually explained that the rules he so dearly cherished only existed because I allowed them to. The power dynamic shifted so fast you could practically hear his brain short-circuiting as he processed the reality of the situation. Still, I could see the flicker of defiance behind his eyes. The man wasn't ready to give up his petty authority just yet. He stammered something about community standards and civic duty, though his voice lacked the thunder it carried minutes earlier. I calmly asked him to show me the specific clause forbidding private aircraft in driveways, and when he came up empty I could tell he was grasping at air. That's when I hit him with the real twist. The HOA bylaws themselves were outdated, and under the terms of my ownership, I had full authority to rewrite, repeal, or obliterate any section I pleased. I could watch the hope drain from his eyes in real time, but I wasn't done yet. I walked him outside and gave him the full tour of my plane, detailing every upgrade, every system check, and every flight plan I had ever filed. The plane was street legal as far as oversized vehicles went, and technically counted as a personal recreational craft, fitting into the same category as RVs or boats, both of which were already permitted by the HOA's own guidelines. By the time I finished, the man looked like he needed a drink, or three. But rather than give him mercy, I laid out my own demands. If the HOA wanted to push this further, they would be forcing me to audit every financial transaction, every fine they had ever issued, and every shady backroom deal they had made with vendors. The threat was clear: back off or I'd burn the entire HOA to the ground with the weight of its own paper trail. He mumbled something about needing to consult with the rest of the board before storming off, his shoes kicking up little clouds of dust as he fled my property like it was cursed. I sipped my coffee and leaned against my plane's wing, watching him disappear down the street, knowing full well this was only the opening salvo in what would become the most ridiculous power struggle this neighborhood had ever seen. Word spread fast. By lunchtime, half the block had already heard about my airstrip driveway and the HOA's latest meltdown. Some neighbors stopped by to offer quiet support, whispering about their own run-ins with the HOA's tyranny, while others merely gawked from a distance, too afraid to pick sides. I knew I wasn't just fighting for my right to park a plane. I was fighting for every homeowner who had ever been fined for painting their door the wrong shade of blue or installing a mailbox that deviated slightly from the approved design. This was bigger than me. It was about proving that property rights still meant something, and that self-important neighborhood overlords didn't get to dictate how people lived on land they owned outright. As the sun set, casting golden light across my gleaming aircraft, I realized something. I wasn't just defending my plane. I was about to rewrite the entire future of this neighborhood, and if the HOA wanted a war, they had chosen the wrong opponent. That night, I polished the propeller and went to bed early, knowing tomorrow would bring the first of many battles. The HOA had made a fatal mistake. They tried to enforce rules on land they didn't even own. And they were about to learn, painfully and publicly, that when you own the whole board, you never have to play by someone else's rules. I fell asleep with a smile on my face, already imagining the look on the HOA president's face when the full force of reality hit him. It was going to be a beautiful day. The next morning, I didn't even need to check my inbox to know that the HOA had scrambled into full-blown emergency mode overnight. Sure enough, by 7 a.m., a certified letter was taped to my door, printed on unnecessarily fancy letterhead with the bold title, "Official Violation, Immediate Action Required." I opened it while standing next to my plane, letting the absurdity wash over me as they claimed my aircraft constituted an unauthorized structure and a visual obstruction negatively impacting neighborhood aesthetics. They even included a grainy photo of my plane, taken from the sidewalk like it was evidence in some high-profile crime scene, complete with a timestamp and an official file number. It would have been hilarious if it wasn't so pathetic. The letter gave me exactly 24 hours to remove the plane, or face fines of $500 per day followed by potential legal action and ultimately property liens. They were doubling down, oblivious to the fact that every threat they made only applied to homeowners who were subject to HOA governance, and I was not one of them. I was the landlord to the HOA itself, which meant every rule they enforced existed at my discretion. But they didn't stop there. Within hours, HOA board members started canvassing the neighborhood, spreading panic about how my plane would destroy property values and attract the wrong kind of attention. They made me sound like some anarchist lunatic who was turning the neighborhood into a private airstrip for smugglers and thrill seekers. Neighbors told me they were getting unsolicited calls from the HOA, urging them to sign a petition demanding the removal of my plane. Some of the more impressionable residents actually believed the nonsense, afraid their perfectly manicured lives were about to collapse because a guy with a pilot's license had moved in. I even saw Pearl Necklace Woman, the HOA's self-appointed enforcer, marching up and down the street, clipboard in hand, trying to guilt-trip families into siding with the board. The smear campaign was laughable. By mid-afternoon, the HOA escalated further, issuing a public statement claiming my plane violated airspace safety and was a potential threat to community tranquility. They framed it like I was operating some rogue airport in my driveway, as if Southwest Airlines was going to start running flights from my front lawn. They also hinted they were pursuing legal options to protect neighborhood integrity, which I knew was code for, "We have no idea what we're doing, but we need to sound tough." By evening, the situation reached peak ridiculousness when they called the local news. A camera crew showed up, parking directly across the street to capture my plane from every angle like it was some alien spacecraft that had landed in suburbia. The reporter tried to get a comment, microphone in hand, but all I said was, "It's my driveway. It's my plane. I own the land. End of story." That clip ran on the 6 o'clock news, and by nightfall, my driveway was a spectacle. Kids on bikes circled the property like it was some tourist attraction. Drivers slowed down to take pictures. Even the local pizza delivery guy asked if he could pose next to the cockpit. Meanwhile, the HOA was spinning itself into a frenzy, holding emergency Zoom calls and firing off panicked emails to their lawyer, who I assumed was learning the hard way that you can't enforce rules against someone who owns the entire playing field. They tried one final stunt, calling the city, claiming my plane was an illegal structure violating zoning laws. A city inspector actually showed up, clipboard in hand, looking more confused than concerned. We stood in my driveway as I handed him all my paperwork, FAA registrations, property deeds, permits, and even the obscure municipal code allowing oversized vehicles on private residential lots. The poor guy scratched his head, took a few photos, and left without saying much beyond, "Well, everything seems to check out." That should have been the end of it, but the HOA refused to accept defeat. They posted a hysterical community alert on their website, claiming that my plane was a symbol of unchecked defiance that threatened the core values of the neighborhood. I printed out the post, framed it, and hung it right next to my pilot's license in my foyer. I realized then that this wasn't just about the plane, this was about power. The HOA wasn't angry about aesthetics. They were terrified that someone had exposed their impotence, that I had shattered the illusion of their authority. They weren't fighting to remove my plane. They were fighting to cling to the last scraps of relevance they had left. And so, with their desperation mounting and their credibility crumbling, they did what all weak regimes do when threatened. They overplayed their hand. The next morning, they announced they were holding a mandatory community emergency meeting to vote on an official resolution demanding my compliance. They called it a democratic solution. I called it adorable. They still hadn't figured out the one thing that mattered most. This neighborhood belonged to me. And the rules they worshipped were mine to write, rewrite, or delete at will. Their vote would mean absolutely nothing. But I was going to attend anyway just to watch their faces when I reminded them exactly who owns this place. The so-called emergency community meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. sharp, held in the community clubhouse, a building I should mention that sat on land I also owned. By the time I arrived, the parking lot was already overflowing with SUVs, golf carts, and the unmistakable nervous energy of homeowners who had been whipped into a frenzy by the HOA's fear-mongering. I walked in casually, wearing a t-shirt with a picture of my plane printed on the front, just to set the tone. The air inside was thick with tension and passive-aggressive hostility, the kind only an HOA could cultivate. Pearl Necklace Woman stood near the entrance, clutching her ever-present clipboard like a lifeline, glaring at me as if my existence had personally ruined her year. At the front of the room, the HOA president sat behind a folding table, flanked by the other board members, all of whom looked like they were about to pass out from either stress or sheer disbelief that I had dared to show up. The president cleared his throat, tapped his gavel against the table, and launched into the most pompous opening speech I had ever heard, complete with phrases like, preserving community values, protecting property integrity, and safeguarding the suburban spirit. It was theater at its finest, and I could barely keep a straight face. When they finally opened the floor to discussion, I didn't even bother to stand up right away. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, slowly raised my hand and said, just to clarify before we start, this meeting is being held in a building that sits on property I own, correct? The president's face flushed, the color of a sunburned tomato as he muttered, that's technically true, yes. And the streets you all drove on to get here? I asked. The sidewalks? The parking lot? More uncomfortable silence followed before the treasurer finally croaked out, yes, those are part of the neighborhood's common areas. Which, I said with a smile, are all legally owned by me. At that point, several homeowners who had been sitting quietly started exchanging wide-eyed glances, as if they were only now realizing just how deep this went. The HOA president pressed on, ignoring the growing sense of doom in the room. He launched into a dramatic reading of the violation notice, outlining how my plane had allegedly broken no fewer than 14 community rules, from aesthetic violations to safety concerns and even something called visual tranquility disruption. When he was done, I clapped. Slow, sarcastic claps that echoed through the clubhouse like gunshots. Beautiful speech, I said. But there's one small problem. None of these rules apply to me. The room shifted like everyone had collectively leaned forward at once. The president sputtered, of course they apply to you. You live here. I grinned. I do. But I'm not just a resident. I own the land the HOA governs, which means the HOA exists at my discretion. You can't fine me. You can't enforce rules on me. And you definitely can't force me to move my plane. You could actually hear the air leave the room. Pearl Necklace Woman started whispering furiously to the secretary, who looked like she was ready to crawl under the table and disappear. The president tried to recover, babbling about bylaws and fairness and precedent, but every argument he made fell apart under the sheer weight of legal reality. I stood up, walked to the front of the room, and placed a stack of documents on the table. Property deeds, ownership records, every legal filing related to the neighborhood's creation and the HOA's original charter. All of this, I said, tapping the papers, proves beyond a doubt that I hold controlling ownership of this entire neighborhood. The HOA exists because I allowed it to exist. That allowance is over. Gasps rippled through the audience. The president's hand shook as he reached for the papers, scanning them with the speed of someone trying to find a loophole that didn't exist. And just to make it official, I added, I'm hereby dissolving the HOA effective immediately. Someone actually dropped their coffee cup. Pearl Necklace Woman let out a strangled noise somewhere between a gasp and a scream. But you can't just do that, the president stammered. I absolutely can, I said. It's all right there in the founding documents. When one entity owns a majority of the lots, that entity holds ultimate authority over the HOA's continued existence. And since I own all of them, that entity is me. The room erupted into chaos. Some people cheered, others panicked, and the HOA board members just sat there, stunned into silence, as the realization sank in that they had just been fired from their unpaid, self-important jobs. I let the noise wash over me, standing calmly at the front of the room, watching the board crumble in real time. Effective tonight, I continued, there are no more HOA rules, no more fines, no more architectural committees, and no more random letters telling people their grass is too tall. You're free. Congratulations. A cheer actually went up from the back of the room, followed by applause from a handful of residents who had clearly been waiting years for this moment. The board members, however, just sat there, looking shell-shocked and deflated, as though someone had sucked all the purpose out of their lives. With that, I turned and walked out of the clubhouse, leaving the former HOA leaders to stew in their own irrelevance. The evening air felt lighter somehow, as though the entire neighborhood had just been liberated from invisible chains. As I strolled back toward my house, the lights from my plane reflected off the street, and I couldn't help but smile. Not only was my plane staying exactly where it was, but the petty tyrants who had tried to remove it no longer had any power at all. For the first time in years, my neighborhood belonged to the people who actually lived there. And as I reached my driveway, I gave my plane's nose a little pat, like a loyal steed that had just carried me through battle. It wasn't just a plane, it was a symbol. Proof that when you own the whole game board, no one can tell you where to park your piece. With the HOA officially disbanded and its self-important leaders stripped of their imaginary power, the neighborhood finally belonged to the people who actually lived there. But I knew leaving a power vacuum wasn't enough. It was time to rebuild the community into something better, something that worked for the residents instead of against them. The very next morning, I sent a neighborhood-wide email explaining exactly what had happened, why the HOA was gone, and what came next. The response was a wave of cautious optimism mixed with sheer relief. People were genuinely thrilled to be free from the petty fines, pointless rules, and constant surveillance that had defined their lives for years. Without the HOA's unnecessary red tape, I had full control to make real improvements using the money they had once hoarded in reserve accounts. First, I hired crews to audit and repair all the neglected infrastructure the HOA had ignored for years: cracked sidewalks, broken streetlights, malfunctioning sprinkler systems in public areas. Next, I established a neighborhood improvement fund that residents could voluntarily contribute to, with 100% transparency and no bloated administrative costs. The plan was simple. If the neighborhood needed something: better landscaping, new park equipment, upgraded community facilities, we'd vote on it directly with no meddling middlemen. Gone were the days of passive-aggressive violation letters and mystery fines that vanished into the void. People actually started talking to their neighbors again, collaborating on improvements instead of spying on each other for minor rule infractions. And the best part? With the HOA gone, people could finally personalize their homes however they wanted. Front yards transformed overnight. Some became lush gardens, others were decked out with lawn art and colorful decorations that would have made the old HOA board faint. Driveways filled with boats, motorcycles, RVs, and yes, my glorious plane, which had now become a neighborhood icon. People started holding block parties without needing permits, grilling in their front yards, setting up inflatable water slides for their kids, and generally living like actual human beings instead of HOA hostages. The park, once a boring patch of grass, was transformed into a vibrant hub with a proper playground, shaded picnic areas, and even a weekend farmers market organized by local families. Without the HOA's outdated rules dictating what was allowed, creativity flourished. One neighbor set up a community lending library in a converted mailbox, while another organized a weekend movie night using a projector and a giant bedsheet strung between two trees. It felt like we had broken out of a prison we didn't even realize we were in, and the sense of freedom was intoxicating. Former board members tried to keep their noses in the air, acting like the neighborhood was falling into chaos, but they couldn't argue with the reality. Property values actually went up because demand to live here skyrocketed. Word spread fast that this was now a luxury community with modern amenities and zero HOA interference, which attracted buyers who wanted high-end homes without the tyranny of a neighborhood council. Real estate listings proudly highlighted "no HOA" as a selling point, and the demand was so intense that homes sold faster than ever before. As for Pearl Necklace Woman and the former HOA president, they both quietly put their homes on the market and moved out within months, unable to cope with the reality that they were no longer in charge. Their departure was celebrated with a block party so massive that someone hired a bounce house and a live band, turning the whole thing into a neighborhood festival. And yes, the plane stayed right where it was, its polished wings gleaming in the sun, a permanent monument to what happens when a neighborhood reclaims its freedom. I even installed a custom mailbox shaped like a mini version of the plane, just to rub it in a little. The neighborhood story went viral online. Local news, real estate blogs, even a few national outlets picked it up, dubbing us the HOA free haven. I got interview requests, offers to write a book about the whole saga, and even a call from a lawyer asking if I could advise his client on how to dismantle their own tyrannical HOA. But for me, the greatest reward was walking outside, seeing kids race bikes down the street, neighbors chatting over coffee, and my plane sitting proudly in my driveway without a single complaint. The community had become a place where people lived, not just existed under the thumb of a committee. It wasn't perfect, No neighborhood ever is, but it was real, honest, and free. And every time I fired up my plane's engine just to give the kids a thrill or parked a new toy in my driveway, I did it with a smile, knowing that I hadn't just won a battle over a plane. I had proven once and for all that real ownership means real freedom, and no clipboard-wielding HOA could ever take that away again. The HOA said I couldn't park my plane in my driveway. Now, not only was it still there, but the neighborhood had been rebuilt around it, freer and happier than ever before. It was my neighborhood, my rules, my plane. And the sky was the limit.